Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Jennifer James, Service Development Consultant at Local Government New South Wales, and I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking today, the Darug and Guringai people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Welcome and thank you for joining us to discuss some of the opportunities and challenges of using recycled materials in roads and pavements from a local government perspective. Thank you too to the Waste Transformation Research Hub for inviting us to participate in this second Circular Economy Conference and for continuing to drive the circular economy agenda forward. We have a great lineup of 6 speakers today, all bringing differing experiences and insights on using recycled materials in roads and pavements. But before we start, I've just got some housekeeping for today's forum, please. If you have any questions from or for our speakers, simply press the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll ask these questions to our presenters during question time at the end of the session. When you ask a question, please include your name and organisation you're from. And if we don't get time to answer all the questions today, those not answered will be forwarded to the relevant speaker after this event. So to open our session, I now have great pleasure in introducing Councillor Linda Scott, our first speaker for today. Councillor Linda Scott is the elected President of the Australian Local Government Association and is serving her second term as the elected President of Local Government New South Wales, having been a board member since 2015. Linda is also serving her second term as a Labor councillor at the City of Sydney, having formerly served as Deputy Lord Mayor. Linda is a professional board director serving as the Deputy Chair of Care Super and is on a range of New South Wales government boards and advisory groups, including the New South Wales Environmental Trust and New South Wales Smart Places Advisory Committee. She volunteers for the University of Sydney Dalziel Mentor Program and raises funds for homelessness services in the annual Vinnie's CEO Sleep Out. Linda appears as a regular media commentator and is passionate about taking action on dangerous climate change, creating quality employment and affordable housing opportunities, and reducing inequality. Welcome, Linda.
Thanks so much, Jen. It's really great to be here, and thanks also to the conference organisers for putting on such a really important, fantastic and interesting event. I also would like to acknowledge the many different First Nations lands that we're meeting on today. I'm speaking to you today from Ghadi land in Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm really proud to be here today, and it's really exciting, particularly as Local Government New South Wales is so delighted to play such an important part in this conference, as we've long advocated for an overhaul of the way that New South Wales does waste and recycling. And as Jen indicated, in my new role as the National Australian Local Government President, I'm also looking forward to taking up the charge on this issue at a national level. We all know we need to transition to a circular economy where waste is seen as a product, not a problem, and we think that local governments have a really important role to play in this, but also state and federal governments need to play their part. Waste is, of course, a critical issue, and it's something I'm really passionate about. In 2017-18 alone, our state generated more than 21 million tonnes of waste, and that's expected, sadly, to grow to more than 31 million tonnes over the next 20 years. And as shipping waste overseas is no longer an option for Australia, we, of course, have to find viable alternatives to manage this issue. So in recognition of the need to innovate, Local Government New South Wales was really pleased to establish a Research and Innovation Fund in 2018 to support research to drive innovation in the local government sector. And for those of you who don't know about this in the local government sector, go and have a look at the Local Government New South Wales website. It's a great research engagement program, and councils really, we want you to look at it and get to know it and take your part in it. So the first project that we funded as a result of this was a guide and technical review on the use of recycled materials in roads and pavements. It's a resource we hope councils can use to inform them about the properties, performance, specifications and considerations of using products like recycled plastic, glass asphalt, concrete or other materials to make safe and durable roads, footpaths, cycleways, etc. We really want to pay tribute to and thank the University of Sydney's Waste Transformation Hub for its outstanding work in producing this guide and technical review. And I'm really looking forward to hearing one of our other speakers, Dr. Amirali Ghadi, lead researcher on the project, who will tell us a bit more about the guide shortly. Reusing waste as a resource not only fosters innovation, but it also creates new jobs, new economic streams, and of course, it's better for our environment. Modelling from the Centre of International Economics suggests that a 5% increase in recycling rates, so that's not a big increase, a 5% increase can add $1 billion to Australia's gross domestic product. Recycling creates 3 times as many jobs as waste sent to landfill. Now, I'm going to meet the Prime Minister on Friday, and let me assure you, this is one of the key messages that I'm going to be speaking with him about. The spike in household waste generated during COVID highlights the importance of what Local Government New South Wales has been calling for through our Save Our Recycling campaign. We need the New South Wales Government to invest urgently to fund councils to help change the way we manage household waste and recycling. Our campaign calls for the New South Wales Government to reinvest the $750 million it collects through the waste levy annually to help fund council-led regional waste plans and build priority infrastructure. And again, we've got some great examples of that on the agenda today. Commit to local and state government procurement of recycled goods made with domestic content, and implement a statewide education campaign to teach people how to reduce contamination of recyclable materials and reduce waste generally. It's vital to increase the pull-through of recyclables sourced from the curb into remanufacturing the fuel to create a circular economy and create new jobs. And at all levels of government, we have a role in driving demand for products and materials with recycled content. Can I say at my council, I'm constantly asking questions about our own procurement, about what we're buying with recycled materials in them to make sure that we are leaders in this field, when of course we continue to call on state governments to do this as well, and federal governments. Councils are also leading the way with trials of recycled contents in roads and pavements and closing the loop through our own procurement, but we need our own sector to do more. We'll hear today from SS Rock's great work in the Paving the Way initiative. This is happening at the moment with councils trying to purchase recycled content sourced from curbside recycling for our roads and our pavements. With the waste export ban starting in early 2021, which is now days away, with a ban on unprocessed glass, the guide and technical review is a useful resource for councils when considering how we will all increase our use of recycled material. Our advocacy also includes working with the federal government to introduce greater producer responsibility schemes for problem waste, such as photovoltaic cells. And there's been recent legislative reform regarding product stewardship, which is promising better outcomes for problematic waste. The revised National Waste Action Plan now has a target to phase out problematic and unnecessary plastics by 2025. This is something we welcome. And New South Wales action is of course likely to follow in the 20-year waste strategy and the New South Wales Plastics Plan that Matt Keane assured me earlier this week were due for publication in March. Of course, by reusing materials, we're also helping to reduce our emissions, of another area that local government is making inroads in, with many councils already having adopted net zero emissions targets. We're really proud at Local Government New South Wales to partner with the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment to recently hold a Pathways to Net Zero Emissions Forum for councils. And this is followed next year with further capacity building webinars. We've also been proud to partner with them for our research fund, which will this year allocate $50,000 as seed funding for applied research to again drive innovation in the transition to net zero emissions. And we're looking forward soon to announcing the winner of that. clearly there's an opportunity for us all to understand and use drivers to create emissions reduction and economic growth, to make strong arguments stack up on many levels and shift us to a greater use of recycled materials in a wide range of ways, including, as I said, in roads and in footpaths. Each tier of government, of course, must take responsibility for planning and building our future. It's been so heartening in my roles to see the great steps undertaken by local government to date to manage, recycle waste and to reduce waste, and broadly our sector's commitment to trialling a range of products, solutions and approaches that move us towards a more circular economy. So thanks again for having me. I'm really looking forward to hearing from all the speakers. Back to you, Jen.
Thank you, Linda. Now, to hear a bit more about the resource developed by Local Government New South Wales to help council engineers navigate this complex area of using recycled materials in roads and pavements, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Amirali Ghadi. Dr. Ghadi received his PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Sydney. And, he has led the team developing this these set of resources. Now he has a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Sydney before starting his career as an academic at its chemical and biomolecular engineering faculty in 2017. His engineering research focuses on waste transformation into value-added products and high-performance membranes for gas separation and water purification. Now, thank you very much, Amirali, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Jen, for the kind introduction. I would like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognize the continuing connection to land, water, and culture. I'm currently on the land of the Ghadi people of Aurora Nation, and I pay my respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Thank you, everyone, for coming by for this webinar. I just start my talk by going through a little bit of waste data. Currently around 60% of the coal waste is actually being recycled in New South Wales, which is seems to be a high recycling rate, but because still 6 megatons of this waste goes to landfill, that's why there's still room for improvement. And especially when we look at, there's a big portion of this waste is from construction and demolition sector, and it's on the rise. So because of the similarity between these two, the materials that we use in roads and pavements, I mean, there is a great opportunity here to reuse them in road construction. Circular economy in New South Wales in general tries to keep products and materials in use for as long as possible, and adapting the same concept, we can come up with this material flow cycle for roads and pavements to reduce, divert, reuse, repurpose, and most importantly, which is the message of this conference, is to focus on design of the product at early on, so allow us to have that circular economy concept going. So at Waste Transformation Research Hub, we're working on some projects. So we'd like to, to encourage you, invite you, if you want more information, you can visit our website. One of the projects that we're very proud to work on in collaboration with LG New South Wales, and I'd like to thank LG New South Wales for this, on behalf of Waste Transformation Hub, for this great opportunity, was to develop a guide for local councils about the recycled materials in roads and pavements. So 2 documents. I put the link here, so Jennifer would send out the slides so you can actually download them for more information. But about the guide, just in a nutshell, what were the motivations was, we all know that recycled materials like glass, plastics being already used and trialed in roads and pavement by councils, but there's always this concerns about compliance with EPA requirements and some of the public perception of the health and safety, and of course the cost to the council, and the challenge is to generate that confidence. So the guide offers a guidelines of how council engineers can make this informed decision about starting recycling projects and how they can incorporate that in roads and pavements. And it tries to do that by around 6 chapters, which I'm going to explain in a nutshell how it works. So we try to break down the whole process in as key implementation steps. So if you are an engineering council and you want to start a recycling project, you first start by reviewing, for example, what are the options out there. So chapter 2 tries to give you that sort of knowledge. For example, you know that glass or fly ash is already being used, so that gives you the green light to move forward. And then you go to step B. So then you need to sort of, what are the first document here is you need to know the resource recovery and exemption from EPA, or what are the specification and standards that you can use to convert that waste recycled materials to your raw materials. So once you have your certified stockpiles in raw materials, and then you need to know what are the technology is available, what are the recipes, what are the recommendations by different standards in case of, for example, you're going to have 10% glass, or in case of contamination, to what extent they need to be addressed. So the final product, and then there's always the concern, okay, so what would be the evaluation and monitoring, techniques? We have some suggestions, and it comes from a big repository of different standards from RMS, from Ausroads, Australian standard, New Zealand standards. So it gives you a list, short-term performance, perhaps, for example, you can see in this table, shrinkage, and then you go to long performance testing, some toxicity, for example, is a key, which will be addressed later on in chapter 4 of the guide, as an assurance that whatever you have in your project is going to give you the final product with a high quality that is comparable, or even in some cases better performing than the virgin materials. And at the same time, it would give you the confidence of you're not violating any environmental regulations, and of course the public domain perception would be positive. So this is what the guide does in a nutshell, and this is just a case study that, for example, we discussed in the guide. I don't want to go through the details. It's one of the pavement that we actually worked on using fly ash, glass, and we incorporated CO2 into the pavement, and we actually followed this guide. And I'm very happy to, later on, after that, to explain if you have any technical questions about this. It's actually going to be discussed at 3 p.m. in a closed meeting. So this is an example of how you can actually follow this guide. So yes, that's from me, and thank you very much for your time, and I would happy to take any questions offline, maybe later, or during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Amirali. It's certainly a very complex piece of work, and thank you for your efforts and that of your team in preparing this. For those of you asking about where to access this, the guide, as Amirali said, will be embedded, or a link to it will be embedded in the slides. But if you're very keen to jump on and have a look, Local Government New South Wales has it on its website under the innovation section of our content search. So there you can click straight through to both the guide and the technical review, which is the lengthier document. So thanks, Amirali.
Thank you.
Well, I guess we'll move now to hear about the experiences and perspectives of some of our small and large councils. And to kick us off, I'm delighted to welcome Boris Bolgov, Director of Roads, Transport, Drainage and Waste at Central Coast Council. Boris has over 18 years of experience in senior leadership roles within local government and holds a Bachelor of Engineering. Boris has a focus on driving capital works, asset management, core operations and service provision in complex regulatory and legislative environments. These outcomes work hand in hand with working on continuous improvement initiatives as well as improving the culture within his department. Since joining Central Coast Council, Boris has played an integral role in the delivery of roads, transport, drainage and waste capital works and operational projects. Boris has a strong passion and desire to achieve sustainable engineering outcomes within a circular economy. Over to you, Boris.
Thanks, Jen. Can you see that I'm sharing the screen? I hope you can.
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Okay. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. I'm on the land of the Darkinjung, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So thank you very much for inviting me along. I'm going to go through this presentation. I'll start with a bit of context, go through some of the projects that we've done at Central Coast Council. Along the way, I'll mention a few challenges and sort of end with some takeaway points. So, just get to the next slide. Okay, so Central Coast is about 80 kilometres north of Sydney and same amount sort of south of Newcastle. There's about 35,000 people, and we've got a fairly large area. It's about 1,600 square kilometres. Won't go through all those all the other stats there, and I do understand that these slides will be made available afterwards. Just again, by way of context, we've got about in the roads and footpaths area, it's about $2 billion worth of assets. So that's, if you essentially draw a line from to north, you end up up in Cairns. We've also got a fairly significant portfolio of the drainage network. Budget-wise, per annum in the portfolio, it's around the $75 million. So it comprises a lot of renewal. Obviously, that's a key area to keep the infrastructure backlog down. But it certainly gives us some opportunities to look at some of the new things. I suppose most of you here actually know a fair bit of circular economy, and you're here because you're interested. So I won't go through too much. Obviously, Councillor Linda Scott has given a fair bit of information at the start in relation to that linear consumption, the fact that we do dispose of most of our 99% of some of our products within 6 months. There is pressure on the environment. We also need to look at the materials. They are as a resource, and certainly that's something. The waste isn't something to throw away. It should be considered as a resource. There's obviously abilities to have some competitiveness in this space, and real opportunity to talk about innovations. And I'm going to look at that a little bit in relation to a structure. I think it's important how you structure your area can lend itself to some of the innovation areas. And not to mention the economic growth and ability for some of the businesses. It's a fairly busy slide that I want to go through. Wesley mentioned resources at the beginning, and you've got that, in the blue, exploration, going to mining, processing, raw materials, and then there's that thinking space. So you've got that design, and Amirali had a similar sort of slide, and this is in the same line as some of that. But that thinking space is really, really critical. What do we do? Do we want to go back to just using those raw materials? So I want to talk about, I'll come back to that in a little bit more detail. But as you can see, it's sort of the conventional thinking, and then you move into that production. And I suppose there's that unconventional thinking where we can reuse, look at our yellow bin collection process, look at that recycling. So I think that component of thinking about the space and the challenges of that mindset. And I think for me, that the design mindset and having staff go through the fact that we've always done it this way is the statements that I've certainly heard when I arrived at Central Coast Council. So you need to be able to challenge that. That's probably one of the biggest challenges for myself and staff. And sort of look at, well, how do you do that? Sometimes you just really need to push through, and I've had the ability to use some of my relationships over the years, using some of the contacts, so that essentially people can see that they've got confidence in you, and then they can move into that space to trial new things. The other thing is trying to embed some of these things into your documentation. I don't think, as a whole, we sometimes refer back to that, and we need to be able to, I suppose, point people to these areas. And some of those areas that we've certainly done in Central Coast Council is looking at your community strategic plan. So, we've got the UN Sustainable Goals in there. We do have a sustainability statement in our community strategic plan, and we've just recently done the Central Coast waste management strategy. And you'll notice to the left there, we've actually left the word waste but put a cross in that because we did want to make a statement. It isn't waste, it is a resource, and that's how we're certainly considering that. I just want to go through, there's a few of the things that we have been doing, and you've been around a while. Some of this is old news, but I'm going to go through it and talk a little bit about how do you promote some of this too. So one of the things that I certainly did, and I noted that Councillor Linda Scott mentioned, she's passionate about that. Just some fact sheets to councillors. I have provided a suite of all similar slides to what I'm showing you, and a bit of an explanation what they are. So it gets people talking about these things, and the more we can get that out there, the more traction we're going to get in this space. So recycled concrete, been around a while, used as a great base in a lot of parts of road path construction. We've got recycled asphalt. Again, it's been around quite some time, but it's taken away. It's not having to use some of that natural resource that I mentioned earlier. So recycled tyres, using your spray seal. So that's combined, using recycled truck tyres combined with your bitumen. You can get, again, a product as good or better than what would you get without that material. So some of the techniques, again, getting it out there. I tend to use LinkedIn. So if we sometimes promote these, do a media release, and then put that out on LinkedIn to try and get a little bit more, again, visibility, traction in this space. Amirali mentioned some of the plastic in pavements and glass. We did a couple of roads a bit over a year ago now, and again, trying to get that information out. To the right there, I've got a bit of an infographic. You might not be able to see it. But working with Downer, we got to do these roads, and a particular road, I think it's about 600 metres, had about 630,000 equivalent plastic bags in that space. Probably running a little bit behind time, so I'll speed up a little bit. With this, the other initiative that because there was glass in there, plastic bags, we targeted some schools where we had to do renewals, and we got the kids to collect the materials that actually went in their road right in front of their school. Just another project. This was an Australian first. This is a bit, this is road stabilisation. To the left is the conventional method. SPA, one of our contractors, brought in some machinery from Germany, and we had this road train which uses a foam bitumen, and I suppose for some of those councils that are in regional areas, this can do long areas very, very quickly, and gets almost to an asphalt type surface at the end. So if there's any questions, again, certainly prepared to talk to people a little bit more about those sorts of things. The other thing, just in relation to some of our partners, we've got obviously collection with the yellow bin. So glass goes through there. Our partner is IQ Renew that collects that, and they are separating all the bottles. Some of the challenges here is that the quality of the glass was fairly poor because it had a lot of the stickers and the wrapping in that, so it didn't actually act as free draining sand. Working with us and with our lab, we certainly got them to put another cleaning process in, which went really, really well, and it's almost like beach sand when you look at it. I suppose success for me is when the staff start coming to me and asking me, what about this, can we do that? And got the idea of, can we make a recycled road? And we got to about 90% recycled. From the pavement area, we're certainly using existing pavements, bringing them back, using the recycled concrete, using the glass, talking to suppliers about putting fly ash in the concrete pipes and using recycled sand and glass in the pipes, recycled plastic pipes for the drainage, the subsurface drainage, even the pathways. Again, using rather than using steel mesh, using recycled plastic as that reinforcement. So again, that's probably one of the highlights for me, as I mentioned, that staff are coming and changing their mindset. I mentioned partners and that relationship. I think it's really important that you get that and invite people in and have a talk about what they have to offer and what you can offer. So there are a few of the partners that we've certainly been dealing with. So last slide, so Jen, don't worry, I'm almost done. Just think about your audience and how can you make that difference. I've mentioned to you, talk to your suppliers. If it wasn't for me inviting Jim Appleby from Downer in probably 12 years ago to talk about improvements, we both might have gone down different pathways. That continuous improvement culture and making sure that you consider the cost as well as the environment. So you just need to think about how you've structured your areas if you're in local government. Have a go. Sometimes I have to say, look, we're going to do this, and that made a difference, but I did think about the consequences and have plan Bs in place. Talk about these things with your neighbouring local government areas. Use avenues such as IPWEA and those regional platforms to get some of that sharing out there. And as in the regional area, like understand your strengths, your gaps, your opportunities, and take action. Promote good work. I think in dealing in a heavy engineering space, it's I'll talk for myself. I'm not good at blowing my own trumpet, but engineers and engineers are doing some great work, but they're not getting some of that promotion out there. And lastly, consider your resources as materials or products. It's not just the primary, it's secondary. Look about, think about what machinery you're using. So there's importance in that physical side. Most of all, think about not just using those natural resources. So it is that thinking space that we need to get into, and have more forums like this to get the message out. That's it. Apologies that I might have gone a couple minutes over. Over to you, Jen.
Thanks, Boris. No, very inspiring. And I'm sorry this is such a fast and furious pace, because there's a lot of information embedded in each of those slides. But as I say, we'll be capturing all your questions and linking you to the speakers if you have specific questions about the presentation. All right, we'll move on. Thank you, Boris. And we'll move on to Sam Henwood from Transport for New South Wales. Sam is a chartered civil engineer with over 25 years experience. Since joining Transport for New South Wales, Sam has led the Geoscience unit and now heads up the Pavements and Geotechnical section in his role as Director, Pavements and Geotechnical. With a team of 55 staff, he is responsible for the provision of technical expertise within engineering services throughout New South Wales. Sam is the Transport for New South Wales Pavement Task Force representative at Ausroads. Welcome, Sam, and thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Great, thanks. We had a few technical issues, so thank you very much. And thank you to my early presenters as well. Really interesting to hear what's happening. And likewise, I'd like to pay my respects to our traditional owners on the land in which we meet today, and to elders past, present and future. I'm going to talk about a few things today. I will talk from a state road agency perspective around, and from a technical side of the state road agency perspective, around some of the challenges that I see for councils, and also some of the opportunities, and what sort of further research in areas that we need to look at, and what's happening. So I'll get straight into it. In terms of challenges, look, there's actually a lot of information already out there, and we heard from Amirali earlier on about research at Sydney University and the collaboration with local government. I can also say from my perspective, there's information in former Roads and Maritime Services, Transport for New South Wales specifications on a whole range of products or resources, recycled products that we can use in road construction and pavements. And that includes everything from earth fill to construction and demolition waste, especially concrete, bricks and tiles. We've got good information on rubber, good information on recycled asphalt pavement, fly ash. We certainly use ground granulated blast furnace slag, a waste byproduct from the steel making industry, is another product we use, as well as glass. And at the moment, we're still, from my perspective, we don't have a good handle on the waste plastic side and use in asphalt, but that's changing. And I'll talk to you towards the end about some of the developments happening in that area. But from my perspective, I think one of the key challenges for local government is really understanding what sort of performance and outcomes you're trying to achieve when you're looking at using a particular waste recycled product. So, for example, if you looked at, say, concrete and brick as an example, that's okay for use in earth fill, provided the product's free of contamination, particularly asbestos, and you can place the product, you can compact the product, you can achieve an earth fill. But if you want to use that product to make, say, a high quality road base material, say a densely graded base 20 millimetre, we need to start looking at that product and start assessing what sort of strength do we need out of those aggregates. What sort of grading are we looking at? We need to think about permeability, and other characteristics like plasticity of the products that we're looking at. And also keep in mind, from a local government perspective, do you really need a Class 1 DGB20, or will a Class 2 DGB20 do? And the criteria are different. So you've got to understand what performance you're trying to achieve, what outcomes you're looking at. Another important point is understanding and characterising the actual recycled product you're using. So, and to do that, you really got to start getting into looking at the test data. So, for example, we make use of fly ash in our concrete, in our concrete pavements that we build, and our non-structural concrete. And for us, when we think about fly ash on the technical side, we are really interested in the fineness and in loss of ignition values for that particular product. And interestingly, fly ash is a really good news story because it not only gives us an environmental benefit, but we get a huge increase in performance, durability and strength, and it reduces cost. So it's a win on every aspect. Another important area would be, say, recycled crushed glass. Here, we're interested in the grading of the glass, and I think Boris mentioned earlier on, we're also interested to make sure there's no contamination of the glass. We don't want to have bits of paper or cardboard. We don't necessarily want sugars or odours. But you need to balance that with what's the purpose of the recycled crushed glass for. So if we're putting it in asphalt, that's one purpose. If we're putting it in concrete, those sugars become very important because that can be a retarder for concrete. So these things need to be understood, characterised, and we need the test data to give us the confidence to use these products as a resource. Some of the key opportunities, and I mentioned them just a little bit earlier, obviously there are huge sustainability benefits if we can turn what we classify as a waste into a resource and use it in our roads and infrastructure and pavements. Sometimes, and hopefully we can get an economic win out of this. We can get a reduction in cost. We also got to look at the performance of using a particular product in an application. Do we get a benefit from using that product? And sometimes we do. Sometimes if you use a product, you can get a huge increase in performance, but you have to pay a little bit more. And that's okay, that's understood. Understand what we're looking at when we're looking at materials. Do we just get an environmental benefit, but with no performance, increased cost? What's the cost of the environment? We need to factor these things in when considering using recycled waste products as a resource in road construction and pavements. And also when trialling new products, it's good to look to collaborate with different people as well. Other research organisations, we've heard from Sydney University and Amirali earlier on, but also state road agencies and your colleagues as well. I think there's a lot of benefit in there. With increased knowledge, increased testing and data, we build increased confidence. And with increased confidence, we can start making our way towards incorporation of products into specifications, and we can get a body of knowledge and build upon that body of knowledge to move forward. Some of the challenges and areas that require a bit more research. Look, I sort of mentioned a few products earlier on, and some we've got a pretty good, reasonably understanding on. Recycled concrete, bricks, tiles, even rubber. We've reasonably good understanding with that. We've got specifications. We can characterise those materials and we can apply them for the purpose needed. With fly ash and slag, some areas we're looking to explore in Transport for New South Wales are just around some of the acceptance criteria. Say with fly ash, that loss of ignition criteria, we know that's an issue that can make a fly ash acceptable or not acceptable. So we're exploring that area and looking to do some research in that space, and also around limitations on slag use. A great circular economy story is recycled asphalt pavement, turning asphalt back into asphalt. We tend to do 5 to about 30% in New South Wales. It is possible to recycle more, but that would require further innovation. It is possible, but at this point, that's where we're at. With the glass, we've got a reasonably good understanding with glass. We've incorporated it into our asphalt specifications, our concrete pavement specifications, and interestingly, Austroads are doing some further research in that space as well, with a project due to complete 3/4 through next year. But with the plastics, I would say we have a limited understanding at an international level on use of recycled plastic in asphalt. And we're not alone here. The Americans realise it as well. And I know the British are in the same boat. And we're actually all working on this together. Not necessarily collaboratively, but we're all pushing in research areas. Some fundamental issues we've got to make sure we bottom out. Obviously, we don't want to cause a waste plastic problem in our oceans when we look at recycling plastic. We need to do testing, independent data, close it out. We don't want to risk our workers. We need to look at the long-term performance of using that product, and we need to consider the reuse of asphalt back as asphalt in the future if it's got recycled waste plastic in that product. So Austroads are doing a significant amount of research and testing in that area. There's a project with RMIT. It's quite a long-term project that'll involve testing and give us a lot more confidence, and that's due to come out about mid-2022. I'm aware the Americans are also doing the same thing, testing as well, and research areas in Western Australia and Queensland are also looking at the same challenge. There's also an interim guideline that Austroads are looking to get out, hopefully early next year, on the same topic of recycled plastics in road surfacing applications. And although that doesn't have testing, it will give a little bit more guidance and information to practitioners on what to look for, what to consider, and hopefully when we get the confidence and the body of evidence right, we can look to really incorporate that in our specifications and progress. That will do. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. You've raised some really interesting points there and some areas for greater exploration and research. There's certainly a lot to do in this field. Look, thank you for that presentation overview. I'd now like to welcome Andrew Francis from Parkshire Council to give us a regional council perspective. Andrew is the Director of Infrastructure at Parks Council, and in this role he's responsible for the water, sewage and stormwater services, major project delivery, management of the natural environment including noxious weeds, Council's sustainability programs and emergency management. No small portfolio. Andrew, welcome very much. Welcome to the session and thanks for your time.
Thanks, Jenny. You can see that presentation okay?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. As with previous speakers, I'd also like to pay my respects to the Wiradjuri people on the land which I am at the moment, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Look, I've been asked to give a brief perspective from a rural and regional council perspective, and had the pleasure of reviewing Amirali's guide at the draft phase, and certainly engaged with a number of my regional colleagues in the Central West to provide some feedback into that, and really to try and flush out some of the key opportunities, risks and challenges that a regional and even rural council may currently face in relation to the use of recycled pavement. But certainly commend Amirali and his colleagues for the guide. The guide they've produced is very thoroughly done, and idealistically myself as a chemical and environmental engineer rather than civil engineer, certainly see the need for a circular economy approach to manage our infrastructure in general, and obviously here specifically talking about roads. I guess I'd like to start by putting a question out to the audience, and that is, what is the role of infrastructure in the circular economy? That is, if we look at building sustainable infrastructure, all the relevant input materials, construction and whole of life considerations for that, does the outcome look different if we think about the infrastructure itself as the product, or just using infrastructure as a key sink to solve other end of life issues such as diversion of waste from landfill? And I wonder if taking either of those differing perspectives will actually drive a different outcome or not. That's just a rhetorical question. So look, just a bit of context here. I'm talking specifically from the Parks Council context, but really, as I said, trying to give a generic rural and regional perspective. So just for a bit of info, Parkshire, a very typical rural regional council, 6,000 square kilometres area. You can see where we are located on the map there, about 15,000 population. Very similar in some ways to the statistics you saw from Central Coast. We've got 1,900 kilometres of road assets, which is about Parkes to Townsville, if we take the same analogy. And of course, other transport assets such as urban footpaths, curb and gutter. So look, I think the key problem for rural and regional councils is obviously such a large geographical area of assets to manage, very low funding, relying on potentially some low rate income and some funding from state and federal government, but also geographically remote from potentially available sources of supply of materials. So most material for things like unsealed roads is usually sourced very locally for both cost and availability. Look, there hasn't been a huge take-up of recycled material, mainly for that reason out west, and certainly also for contractors themselves who are familiar with the products, and of course potentially any funding delta between standard engineering materials versus recycled materials. So any trialling or use that has been undertaken by councils out this way has usually been in conjunction with RMS or Transport for New South Wales on state-funded roads, which are managed in that case by local government but funded by Transport. There are some small councils that I've talked to who have been managing their own supply chain, obviously crushing and reusing their own glass and getting some good outcomes there. So look, I guess the key issue, I think, from a regional or rural council perspective, it goes back to some of the considerations that we heard from Central Coast. You know, for example, in Parkes, 97% of our roads are constructed of flexible pavement and 70% of those are unsealed roads. And without pavement binding on the unsealed roads, over time there's a large loss of material to the environment. Now, the guide itself doesn't really treat gravel or flexible pavements or unsealed roads in that respect, other than in relation to bitumen products. So I think there is some future work that can be done to understand how gravel pavements can best benefit from a circular economy approach or some other alternate recycled material. But you can see there some of the key considerations, again, from a regional council, 416 million total value for transport assets. And as a kind of an indicator of overall council expenditure, transport, especially from a capital perspective, is certainly from Parkes, council's perspective, makes up 40 to 50% in some cases of total council capital expenditure. So there is a key driver, I guess, for rural and regional transport engineers to make the dollar spread as far as possible, which is one of the key considerations for material use and construction techniques. So look, obviously for our city cousins, you know, ideally for a rural perspective, this is what our assets would look like upon rehabilitation or newly constructed. On the left there, you can see a recently rehabilitated rural road, an unsealed road, and on the right, an urban but flexible pavement, spray sealed road. Now, again, for Parkes as the example, there is a massive backlog gap for funding in relation to the number of roads that don't currently meet the expected condition for the road users. And I guess where I'm going, I don't mean to sound negative for this, but I think one of the key considerations from a rural perspective is really the funding gap, and that is a real consideration when it comes to potentially looking at a slightly more complex delivery of a road program where substitute materials may be being considered by an engineer that is unfamiliar with them. So really, from a rural perspective, we're looking at balancing short-term lower cost versus, you know, the longevity of a higher upfront cost but longer life cycle cost. And at the end of the day, with short funding cycles, unfortunately, the upfront lower cost usually wins out on an annual basis for those. But essentially, if I break down the key considerations, I think from a rural and regional perspective, and the thinking I think that an engineer would go through in looking at using alternative materials for construction is really around the performance of material, the longevity, the cost and the complexity of delivery, both in the physical delivery, but also things like procurement and supply chain. So if we start from a hierarchy and say, if I'm going to substitute a material, am I better off financially by doing so? If there's a net positive cost or improvement for using that material, then fantastic, let's proceed. Now, if I substitute a material and financially the impact is neutral, what are the other benefits that I'd get from that? You know, are there any other additional either non-cost benefits such as improved constructability, improved longevity, work health and safety risks, environmental risks? But then if I substitute a material and I'm financially worse off in the short term, are there strong, robust arguments or benefits that I can utilise to demonstrate to the community, to councillors, to CFOs, the benefit that they get for the increased costs? What are the direct benefits now versus potentially the long-term benefits? And can I demonstrate a positive NPV over the life cycle of the road asset? Now, if the key benefit is then to improve the sustainable nature of the long-term road management, and going back to my question at the start, and to reduce the impact of waste in New South Wales, for example, then how can we quantify those benefits in a way that we can use to engage with the community for feedback on their preferred approach? So this goes back to the IPNR approach that Boris was talking about as well. How can we be armed with the information to go to the community to make these informed decisions and get their feedback when we potentially have non-quantified information? And to me, this is where the guide comes in and really addresses this quite well. You know, so specifically for local government engineers, providing the information to have those informed conversations with key stakeholders, with state, federal government, with CFOs, community councillors, and specifically contractors that will be essentially delivering the work. So look, just to some specifics, I guess, where we are really focused in regional area. I think that things like one of the key sustainable methods of road reconstruction, I think, is around in situ recycling of material. Now, again, this wasn't really touched upon as a part of the guide here, but certainly from a circular economy perspective, sustainability and economic perspective, it's one of the real key drivers of a sustainable outcome for rural road management. So the in situ recycling of pavement material, both unsealed and sealed roads. In unsealed roads, certainly around reconstructing the sub-basin base and maybe adding a small gravel overlay to that for the wearing course. And in some cases in urban areas, obviously recycling of milled asphalt, but probably in much smaller volumes in regional areas. So for example, just to use some cost, and in this case, I think cost is a good surrogate for sustainability and or carbon footprint. But for example, from Parkshire Council's perspective, road maintenance and renewal costs per kilometre has reduced by 15 to 20% annually. And that's taken on a per kilometre basis, purely with the purchase, as you can see on the screen there, of a in situ pavement recycling machine, a Polvi, sometimes with the addition of lime or other stabilising agents. But you can see purely just using cost as a surrogate, because in this case, really the costs are distance travelled for material and sourcing of the material themselves. It's really a key driver, I think, and one of the key focus for sustainability of gravel and flexible pavement roads in rural areas. Now, I think one other area that potentially hasn't really been touched on, but certainly I think is worth looking at, is the use of polymers, especially on unsealed roads. There's been a lot of trials in rural and regional areas around the use of surface applied polymers to bind up the surface clays and reduce the long-term loss of materials, so potentially push out the lifespan of a road post renewal. And certainly polymers as an output are potentially a key product that can be developed from a recycled plastic stream, for example. Now, if we take the problems that I've discussed and flip them, I guess, as opportunities, this goes back to the question that I posed at the beginning. while the problem is that there is a fair proportion of large unsealed and sealed flexible road pavement out in regional areas, that also provides an opportunity if we're looking at roads and other infrastructure as potentially a source of solving the waste issue rather than necessarily the infrastructure being the key focus itself. So there is a large volume of lineal infrastructure there that can be utilised as part of the waste reduction problem. Let's call it a sink or a lineal landfill, for want of a better term. But I guess at the end of the day, it really also comes back to, from a rural perspective, geography, the availability of products in a high enough volume and at reasonable cost to then deliver those for use in those projects. One of the key considerations for that then obviously is supply chain. Now look, I'm just going to touch on the Park Special Activation Precinct, not by way of marketing, but just purely as an example where I think that as asset owners, in this case as road asset owners, as a key part of the circular economy delivery of that, we need to potentially be looking upstream and working with the contractors, the companies that are potentially looking to commercialise products. And so I think a key part of that is essentially driving the need for those products, providing the suppliers a confidence that there is a market out there, but also really understanding the logistics of that and really getting efficient at how those products can be moved around. There is a large volume of waste material in obviously key areas being metro areas, and there is a large geographical area to spread that across, for example, here in New South Wales. I think so a key part of that obviously becomes working with logistics operators as well as working with companies that are looking to pilot or commercialise products to get those into the market. So the Park Special Activation Precinct here as an example being an eco-industrial park which seeks to really promote resource recovery and other activities while linking those directly back to key transport linkages north, south, east, west across the state, I think is just a good example of where as asset owners and as engineers, we should also still be looking both upstream and downstream as part of that supply chain to drive the right outcomes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. That was great, and a really good segue to the final speaker. I urge people to stay on the line. We can continue for another 10-15 minutes. So, and I know a lot of you would be interested to hear what the Southern Sydney Region of Council is doing with their Paving the Way project. So can I introduce Justin Bonzi, who is Strategic Lead Resource Recovery at SS Rock, whose 11 member councils in Metro Sydney manage about 20% of the waste in New South Wales. So I'll hand over to you now, Justin. Thanks very much.
Hi, thank you, Jen, and thanks to all the great presentations. Just before I start, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the SS Rock region, the peoples of the Daru, Darwal, and Eora nations, and elders past, present, and emerging. So I think we're running low on time, so I'll try to make this as quick as possible, but there's a lot of information. So firstly, about SS Rock, or the Southern Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils. We're an association of 11 councils on this map that you can see, representing 1.7 million people, and collectively, we manage about 20% of the waste in New South Wales. So what we've done recently is we've been working for the last couple of years to develop a large-scale procurement of asphalt with recycled crushed glass as a substitute for natural sand. And this is based on Transport for New South Wales and AUSPAC specifications. It's taken a few years to get to this point, but having those specifications updated last year has provided a lot of certainty to our stakeholders. We aim to create local recycling demand, so local demand that will then increase the local recycling rate for a third of curbside glass collection for our councils, which is equivalent to around 70 million glass bottles per year. The contract for this will begin in July 2021, and it will also monitor volumes of recycled materials and greenhouse gas emission reduction, and it will be open to all Metro councils to join. So why did we do this? Firstly, a regional waste policy of SSROC, one of them is that we're responsible for all of our own waste and managing it throughout the life cycle as close as possible to where it was created. So building in the proximity principle, it's not adequate to leave it to others to hope they solve the problem. We want to be as responsible and accountable to our residents as possible and really try to find solutions for this. So in 2017, China's national sword policy and the subsequent COAG export bans revealed critical shortage of domestic markets and processing infrastructure. A lack of viable markets for these recycled materials threatens curbside recycling and increases prices. And local governments, all local governments are in a strategic position to drive demand by incorporating Australian recycled content, which then stimulates infrastructural investment and job growth. The key here is Australian recycled content. Having recycled content is great, but having it locally recycled has that additional stimulus on infrastructure, jobs, and the local economy. So why glass versus plastics or anything else? It's been tested and proven by SSROC and other New South Wales councils now for decades. There are widely accepted and respected specifications. So Transport for New South Wales and AUSPEC, like I said, having updated their specifications last year, that was pretty much opening the gates wide and taking this and running with it. Glass represents about 30% of the entire weight of all recycling collected curbside. So they're very high tonnages. That's about 62,000 tons per annum in the participating councils in this procurement, which means high gate fees at the MRF, as well as a high cost of recycling. We know that only about 65% of this curbside glass has local markets, 60% roughly for higher order uses like bottle manufacturing or bottle-to-bottle outcomes, and about 5% in local civil works projects. So there's a lot of potential to grow. Some of the barriers for this, and there were many. The first, as I mentioned before, has been a critical shortage of local markets and reprocessing infrastructure. For example, glass beneficiation. We have been working quite hard to understand the total capacity and throughput of existing facilities, but we also know that that's not enough, especially if more councils join, or as we're seeing now, Transport for New South Wales prioritizes recycled crushed glass in their asphalt. That's going to increase demand dramatically. We know that there's murky data on the fate of these recycled materials beyond the MRF. This information is actually protected by the POEO Act. So we completely understand that situation due to commercial and confidence considerations. However, that makes it very difficult for us to have 100% evidence-based information to use for our procurements. We know that change of any kind brings risk, but I would stress that business as usual is even riskier. We're currently wearing the risk to the extent that we're not getting the outcomes that we want, and we have huge stockpiles of waste, and we certainly haven't made our roads and pavements as sustainable as they could be. We're certainly working on it, but we're wearing that risk right now. There's been a misperception that recycled crushed glass is still in the trial stage. It has been trialed for decades, but I think, as I mentioned earlier, when Transport for New South Wales and AUSPEC updated their specifications to allow a range of glass in the wearing course, base and sub-basin roads, as well as in non-structural concrete, that pretty much opened the door. That was, I think, a big turning point that said this is no longer a trial. This is a standard input into these applications. We also noticed there's been poor coordination between engineers, waste and sustainability teams within councils. For example, bringing glass into asphalt has multiple positive outcomes. So if you look at triple bottom line type things, some of the people in these teams won't necessarily be looking across the spectrum at all of the different outcomes. So bringing them together has been really important for this. And then, of course, demand from individual councils has been insufficient to move the market. Some councils have gone to market for asphalt with RCG and haven't received a response because the demand has been too low to justify the necessary investment. But as we know, change creates opportunity. So with SS-ROC's Paving the Way procurement, our objectives have been to drive a closed loop market for about 1/3 of council domestic glass collections, to aggregate demand, to stimulate investment in regional infrastructure and jobs, because as we know, demand from individual councils is insufficient. So if we bring together the demand from 16 different councils at once, that would certainly create a more favorable investment environment for industry. We'd also want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by limiting the transportation of glass as well as the sand that it's replacing, which is the largest greenhouse gas component of asphalt. We also want to develop a leading sustainable procurement framework and contract model that other councils could then adopt or adjust as necessary so they don't need to reinvent the wheel. We also wanted to use this as an opportunity to reinforce the importance of source separation and the community's role in a circular economy. Basically, what you put in the recycling bin, we're working hard to make sure that everything is recycled and it's making stuff. So what have we done to date to get to this point? It began in 2018, where we held a forum and a workshop with then RMS, the EPA, and a wide range of local government stakeholders from waste, sustainability, procurement, engineering, basically bringing everybody together in a room and working out the issues, the barriers, the technical considerations, and so forth. In 2019, all SS-ROC councils unanimously signed an MOU to prioritize recycled materials in procurement. And that was aligned with the COAG announcement of the export ban timeline. Now, we found that this is a simple, non-binding way for councils to signal their intent, and by getting GMs and CEOs to sign off on this MOU, it makes it a lot easier for everyone else in council to run with it and work on a solution. We then informed and engaged the support of Ministers Keane and Hancock, as well as Minister Constance. Crucially, we've been collaborating closely with Transport for New South Wales on specifications and parallel approaches to the market. So we're not jointly approaching the market, but we've been doing it in our own ways to try to aggregate demand overall, and that has sent a very strong message to industry that we're serious about this. And again, I'd like to take that opportunity to thank Transport for New South Wales for their very proactive involvement in our work to date. I'm not sure if we would have been able to do it without them to this extent. And then in 2020, early this year, we held a joint forum with Transport for New South Wales and NatSpec on recycled materials in pavements. And we brought together all engineers and waste managers from all sorts of Metro Sydney councils. I think we had 60 to 70 people attending. And this is to inform them, this is what's available, this is what we're doing. And then we commissioned a value chain analysis on recycled crushed glass. And this took into consideration, what is the supply of glass within the region? What are the different applications? What are the different considerations and so forth? And we commissioned that from a civil engineer who's been working in this space for decades, to include all of the technical considerations as well. And we did that to make sure that by creating demand for glass and civil works, we weren't actually creating perverse outcomes by taking away from bottle-to-bottle outcomes. And this showed that we weren't doing that. There's plenty of glass to go around. And then we finalized the commitment from our participating councils and developed and issued our request for tender. And the RFT has now closed, and we're currently evaluating the suppliers for that. So I wanted to really stress this, working closely with Transport, the EPA and the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. We developed jointly this fact sheet, which has FAQs, answers to all of the, the regulatory questions, anything that could be holding stakeholders back from bringing recycled crushed glass into asphalt. And this basically answers all of it. And it really outlines in a very easy to understand way what this process is. But I think beyond that, it also signals a coordinated state and local government support for recycled crushed glass. It's also provided certainty to stakeholders, which is very important when dealing with risk. and it's alerted the market to our upcoming demand. So what are the initial impacts of our procurement expected to be? So we know that the aggregated demand between SS Rock and what Transport is currently doing will more than double the current RCG demand in New South Wales over the next 2 to 3 years. We understand it's currently about 60,000 tonnes, and this will more than double it. As more councils come on board, who knows? There's a lot of potential for this. As I mentioned, it'll create a local market for all remaining recoverable glass in SS Rock, equivalent to about 70 million glass bottles per annum, and may pull glass in from other areas. It will increase the local recycling rate from about 65 to 79%. And that's largely because the glass that is collected here and then is shipped elsewhere to be processed and this and that, well, like for example, the MRF glass, because there's no local application for it, a lot of it's being sent to Victoria and South Australia where they are using it in civil works. Well, that won't necessarily need to happen now because there's local demand for it. It will also reduce greenhouse gas emissions by saving transport costs, and that also includes the emissions from bringing sand in from the quarry in Goulburn, for example, or from the ACT. It will also stabilize the cost of recycling services by increasing the value of MRF glass, which has gone down quite a bit after bringing in the container deposit scheme in New South Wales. We know that it will reduce demand for virgin materials. It will increase regional resilience with new and improved local infrastructure capacity, which other councils could also take advantage of. It is clearly demonstrated for us in doing the background data work for this that the poor transparency of end market data, it really impedes us from making a 100% evidence-based decision. We've had to do a lot of research to understand what's happening with glass at the other end. It's also a tremendous opportunity to educate the community on their very important role in source separation. And then also we wanted to establish an effective procurement and contract model, including sustainability reporting for future similar procurements. So if we move on to concrete or asphalt with plastic in it, for example, we've already got the model down. So where to next? This contract is planning to begin in July 2021, and it will monitor the recycled material volumes and greenhouse gas emission reduction. We're doing a parallel project to embed sustainable procurement guidelines within SS Rock councils. And then, as I mentioned, we'll be using the procurement and contract model to drive other key recycled materials. For example, concrete with RCG, greencrete, as well as quite a bit of research we're currently doing now on products using curbside plastics. And that's it. So please feel free to reach out anytime if you have any questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Justin. Another example of some really progressive work in this area, and I'm sure the whole sector will be watching closely to see, you know, what the outcomes are, and as you also continue to evolve into different products.